Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Something is different in the Federal Register online database. Users noticed in August that numbers got much less precise, search results were truncated, and meaningful summaries had disappeared. Here to report on what's happening and why it matters is VP for Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Wayne Cruz. Mr. Cruz, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you thinking of us.
You've written recently that there's a problem with the Federal Register, which seems like a pretty core assertion. Before I ask you to tell me the problem, though, just give us some background on what the Federal Register is supposed to do and why it matters.
Yeah, sure. On the one hand, we have Congress and all of its laws, and there are a few dozen of those to a few hundred every year. But we also have the Federal Register, which is the daily depository of rules and regulations that the federal government issues throughout the year. And obviously, there's the paper print edition of it. And one little quirky thing I noticed about a month ago is on the online database, when you search the online advanced search database, the precise figures have disappeared. Now you'll get a gross number with a plus sign by it, for starters.
And it's pretty amazing to think that people are still printing the Federal Register. Mm-hmm. Most people, I assume, access it electronically.
Well, that's true. Let me give you an example of what happened. What I do each year, I write an annual report called 10,000 Commandments, which is kind of a survey of trends in federal regulations. I got the notion way back in the 90s. I'd worked at the Food and Drug Administration. I'd worked on Capitol Hill. I'd worked at other groups in town. And a lot of groups were working on tax and budget issues. You could always look up and see the debt, the deficit, the debt, all these sorts of things that we fight over these days. Regulations, kind of a hidden tax in the mind of some people, but those were different. You couldn't easily or readily look up the cost of regulations and the numbers of rules. So, long story short on it, I started compiling Federal Register page counts, numbers of rules, numbers of proposed rules, numbers of rules that affect small business, numbers of rules that are significant, numbers affecting state and local. You get the notion. But guess what has happened? Each week, I do a little, just so I don't lose my mind at the end of the year when I try to compile the 10,000 Commandments report and pull the 3,000 regulations together. I put together a weekly update, kind of a little spreadsheet, showing each of those little metrics I just showed you. And it used to be, for example, you could go and look at last year's Federal Register rule count, and it was like 3,245, whatever the count is. Now, though, if you go to the Federal Register Advanced Search Database and search that, you get 3,200 plus. And then if you go down to the bottom and you try to click through those rules, you can sort them by priority, you can sort them chronologically. But when you go through the first 10 clicks, you know how you click 1 through 10 on the bottom of a web page, and then you got 20 records on each page? Once you get past the 10, it grays out and you can't go any further. So we sent out, what do you do these days? You send a little tweet out, and you put the @ sign for National Archives, you put the @ sign for the Federal Register, you put the @ sign for OMB. They've presumably got some yank over there since they review rules and regulations. But it's been this way now since August 22nd. And just for example, today I went on, it's a little over 1,820 rules so far this year, which is actually on track as it happens, incidental to our talk here. But that happens to be on track to be the lowest ever tally of of rules in the Federal Register ever. Back in the 70s, the rule counts are over 7,000. They've been 4,000 through the 90s. Lately, been mostly at 3,000 and a little extra of that. But when you go, I had to go individually and hand count each day's rules for this week to be able to come on and tell you, yeah, it's 1846 today. It just says 1,800 plus, but it does this for every single thing you try to search in the database now. If you're looking up executive orders, it won't just say there are 208 executive orders, including the ones from Biden. It'll say 200 plus, and it's extremely annoying because, and plus, if you've got an administration now that thinks it's presumably deconstructing the administrative state, that they would want to brag about their precise numbers of rules, but yet it's kind of frustrating for me trying to go on and tally because I'm anticipating the end of the year and thinking about, I'm going to compare regulatory cost and rule counts and page counts and all that stuff to the debt and the deficit and say, we got the on budget federal scope and then here's this off budget side. And it's a little bit annoying to see to see the precise cardinal numbers go away and we kind of have this other kind of fuzzy approach.
I'm speaking with Wayne Cruz. He's the Vice President for Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So beyond it just being annoying, what's the impact of this imprecision in the Federal Register?
Probably the two watchwords you always hear in Washington are always transparency and disclosure, and nobody's hiding anything. I mean, I want to think that this is like a reworking behind the scenes of the Federal Register database, but there hasn't been any response officially on why it's changed. There's been no notice about it or anything like that. But transparency always matters. We're about to have a gargantuan debt fight again and budget fight again coming up at the end of the fiscal year. But at least we can look up the debt and see what it is down to the penny. And there's nothing like that for regulation. So we already don't know regulatory costs. What we do know are the counts, and that's kind of the least we can ask. But then when it gets to where you can't even tally them, that becomes difficult. And the other reason it's a little bit of a problem is some of the recent legislation we've had. And, Congress has always done big things, and there's always been debates about Congress exceeding its enumerated powers and things like that. We kind of come at things from a small L libertarian perspective, so that's why you hear me talk like that. But Congress has done the CARES Act, the infrastructure law, the inflation law, the chips and science law, the TikTok ban. A lot of what Congress does that is already heavy spending, in terms of hundreds of billions in contracts and procurements and funding of different kinds of things. Those kinds of laws are already regulatory before the administrators even start to pick up their pen and pencil. So in addition to those regulations that are now a little bit harder to count, Congress, the agencies issue guidance documents, notices, bulletins, circulars, administrative interpretations, all these sorts of things that we took to calling regulatory dark matter. And so you've got a little bit of not just the obscurity of regulatory dark matter that as it happens, the House has already passed a bill this year. The Senate is about to pass something called the GOOD Act, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act, kind of named after the regulatory dark matter notion, which would require portals for the various guidance documents. So if we're going to do portals for guidance documents and do better disclosure and transparency there, we certainly ought to be able to do the easy stuff that we've always done since 1975 when we tallied up rule counts in the Federal Register and executive orders and proposed rules and all that stuff. So we ought not be losing one form of transparency or sort of blurring it at the same time we're attempting to add others. Those are good things to do. And transparency is bipartisan. I mean, even under the Biden administration a couple of years back, there was a bill passed that almost nobody noticed that requires at the front of each rule in the Federal Register that there be a little 100-word summary recapping exactly what the rule is all about. Great bipartisan thing to do, but, disclosing the numbers of proposed and final rules in a readily trackable way, in a way you can do it across years, is a good thing to do, and we've lost that.
One of the things I hear you saying is that the Federal Register is a place where anybody who's doing legislation or regulatory rulemaking ought to start their homework to do the research to make sure that whatever they're proposing now doesn't go at cross purposes with something that's already there. And these gaps that you're talking about make it harder to do that good research.
It sure does. And even just for me, it's just a minor annoyance since I do this weekly update. And if the figures aren't there exact when I pull the advanced search up, I can just go and hand count it. But it's very tough, and it's a deeper problem when you try to go beyond. As I'd mentioned to you, you can do up to 200. And then when you try to go past that field, you get a circle with a line through it. So it's definitely glitching right now. What I want to assume, although there hasn't been a report, what I want to assume is that there's behind-the-scenes cleanup and scrubbing and updating technology. Remember, that's what the DOGE was supposed to be initially. That's it's not Department of Government Efficiency only that's going to do this big report next year at America 250, but it's supposed to be the digital services unit that is to improve computer systems. Well, the Federal Register database is a computer system.
Well, who's responsible for making these fixes and getting it back online, and also for telling the public what's going on with the system right now?
Well, I'm surprised there wasn't well, maybe there has been behind the scenes. You've had, maybe OMB is called National Archives, maybe the General Accountability Office has weighed in, because it will often do surveys of regulatory disclosures and whether cost-benefit analysis is being done, risk analysis, all that sorts of thing. So there are a lot of parties involved, or who should take note. I'm just surprised that after a month they haven't done it yet, or at least put out an official report. Maybe us talking about it this morning will trigger somebody to pick up the phone somewhere and say, hey, let's get these figures back online.
Indeed. Maybe we'll raise the flag up the flagpole here. I've been speaking with Wayne Cruz. He's the Vice President for Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Mr. Cruz, thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.